Hello. For this lesson, I assigned you a couple of rather controversial anthropologists to read. After spending much of the last week talking about things like revolutions in anthropology, big social movements, civil rights, and feminism, all these changes that took place in the 1980s, the influence of post-structuralism and Foucault, I'm having you read from a couple of prominent anthropologists who some of their contemporaries described as being regressive during this era. However, they were making arguments that I want you to be familiar with that do represent in different ways to be breaks from the way anthropology was done before and that do contribute in some amount to how anthropology is done today. So let's start with Marvin Harris. Marvin Harris, he also attended Columbia University in the 1940s, and he completed his PhD in 1953. He was a scholar of both Brazil and of Portuguese-speaking Africa, and he began his career in the Boasian tradition. His dissertation, fieldwork, and such were all done in that way, trying to provide this empirical description of the people that he was studying. But Harris changed his mind later on, and he started to develop a different kind of anthropological theory. As part of the ecological anthropology tradition, or someone who's seen as having made a contribution to ecological anthropology, Harris somewhat overtly opposed the idea that human culture is primarily driven by ideas. Rather, he argued that human beings belong to ecosystems and that human culture can basically be seen as doing rational things within the ecosystems that we inhabit. Rationality was very important to Harris. He very much thought of himself as a scientist, and he very much thought of human behavior as rational. In the reading that I assigned to you, the object of Harris's argument is that people who believe, and he's talking about his peers in the United States, people who believe that, but not anthropologists, just to be clear. I don't think this was something a lot of anthropologists in his day thought, but in mass culture, people who believe that the behavior of cultures, people in cultures that they don't understand, is irrational. He was speaking against that position. He wanted to show that the things that people do within their ecosystems make sense. So apparently when Harris published this work, a lot of people in his society were very vexed by the veneration of cattle in India. People were seeing the condition of hunger in places in India, and they were saying, why don't those people just eat their cows? They're so irrational for revering cows. And people saw this reverence for cattle as something irrational. And to make a long story short, Harris, he argues that there's nothing irrational about the veneration of cattle in India, and that if you actually take the time to understand Indian culture better, you'll see that it makes a lot of sense. And he goes on to do sort of the same thing, talking about the abstinence of pork in Jewish and Muslim culture. And he cites a well-known anthropologist, Roy Rappaport, in his study of people in New Guinea, whose ornate rituals, which involved extensive pig slaughters at some point, did a lot of important things in their local ecosystem and regulated the pig population there. But I mentioned that Harris is controversial. While we can see that his anthropological work, we can see it in the body of those that were turning away from 20th century Boasian cultural anthropology, but he saw himself very much as a scientist. And he did not like post-structuralism very much. And after the 80s, he was pretty opposed to the influence that post-structuralism and postmodernism had in anthropology. As you recall from our writing culture discussion, post-structuralism challenged the notion of authoritative knowledge per se, knowledge itself as something, post-structuralism framed knowledge as being something bounded by language and discourse and overdetermined by its own cultural contexts. That was not how Marvin Harris saw things. He didn't see knowledge that way. He didn't see science that way. For Harris, he believed that human culture is describable and it's understandable through scientific means, largely through the context of its own ecosystem. And he developed a bit of a reputation for being kind of a belligerent colleague to a lot of people in his day, arguing with them about these kinds of things. Next, we're going to talk about another reading that I assigned you from another anthropologist who may be the most controversial of them all, Napoleon Chagnon. In the 1960s, Chagnon conducted his fieldwork with the Yanomamo people, or some people say Yanomami, in the Amazon, in the Venezuelan Amazon, doing what was pretty standard for ethnography in his day. He did field work with the people, he studied their kinship patterns and documented all these things, etc. But I'm sure that when reading this chapter, that you noticed that it was different from some of the other things that we've read. Similarly, Chagnon developed a theory that is also pretty different from what most of 20th century anthropology produced. Reading the chapter that I assigned you, you don't really see the same kind of relativistic language that we see in modern anthropology. Rather, Chagnon describes the Yanomamo people as being almost overwhelmingly, all-consumingly violent. And he developed what is known as a socio-biological theory to account for this behavior, for this violence that he saw. And to put it very simply, Chagnon argued, first, that Yanomamo society is objectively violent. He basically said we have to take this as a social fact. These are violent people. They fight each other and kill each other at a very high rate. And he explained this as being the case because Yanomamo men fight over women for reproductive access. And he then says the most violent men achieve the highest level of reproductive success. And through generations after generations after generations of this has essentially bred a more violent group of people. Now, the degree to which he means that genetic traits for violence have been selected, creating people who are inherently more violent than others, is something that has been debated. But whether or not that's what he means or what he meant, that's certainly how a lot of people interpret it, including people who opposed and supported that idea. Chagnon's work has actually been pretty influential outside of cultural anthropology, but it has not been received as well by the majority of anthropologists. The first edition of this book was actually published in the late 1960s, and through time, as anthropology changed and these things that we talked about in the 70s and 80s took place, his work has not aged well in the discipline. But people outside of anthropology think pretty highly of it. The book that I assigned you a chapter from is one of the best-selling works of anthropology ever written. This controversy over his work comes from two places. One is that his argument can be read as suggesting that there is innate difference between some peoples on Earth. This kind of argument almost always leads to violence against people, and there is an argument, a pretty well-supported argument, that the government of Venezuela historically cited Chagnon's ethnography to justify their own violence against the Yanomamo people. The second source of this controversy is something that's actually debatable. In the year 2000, there was a book that was published And it argued that the reason that the Yanomamo people in Chagnon's study were as violent as they were is because he made them that way. His presence and the things that he did when he was there inspired and created violence among the people that he then documented. He disrupted their society. He violated their customs continuously. He antagonized them. He fought with them. And he introduced lots and lots of weapons to them. This book also argued that he exacerbated a measles epidemic that resulted in mass death among the Yanomamo people, among many other nefarious behaviors. When this book came out, people took it at face value, and Chagnon suffered a pretty successful character assassination, I guess you might say, from the allegations made in this book, which stuck pretty well in cultural anthropology because a lot of cultural anthropologists didn't really like his work very much anyway. However, an investigation was done that showed that many of the allegations in this book were demonstrably untrue. They did not happen. The journalist who wrote this book literally fabricated a lot of this information, and every investigating agency officially cleared Chagnon of wrongdoing, at least in the terms of the accusations that were made by that book. But as a member of the anthropological community, I'll say that people still state some of these things as if they're true. Still kind of take for granted that he did this. And I'm not going to tell you what to think about Chagnon and his argument, but I am telling you what it is, and I'm trying to explain why a lot of anthropologists feel uncomfortable with it. And it's also noteworthy for our discussion of how anthropology is often at odds with other scientific disciplines, and the fact that Chagnon's work has been better received outside of anthropology. A lot of psychologists think pretty highly of his work, for example. Part of Chagnon's popularity outside of the discipline of anthropology is that he provides a biological account for human behavior, which, though that is not what anthropology typically does, we tend to identify social causes for human behavior. The society that we are part of in anthropology, generally speaking, is much more comfortable with explaining things biologically. So that's all for this lesson. Take care, and I'll see you soon.